Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Federica Bruschi, and I am a PhD student in Chemical Sciences in the University of Perugia. And today I'm going to present our work concerning the Calderone Glacier. The glacier we are analyzing is located on the Gran Sasso complex in the Apennine area, and you can see it on the map on the right. I also want to ask you to notice the other site highlighted in the map that is called Monte Martano, which is 200 kilometers far from the Gran Sasso mountain. I will talk about this second site later, so please try to keep it in mind. The glacier is in a valley below the Corno Grande, between 2,700 and 2,900 meters on the sea level. The Calderone Glacier is, at present, the most southern glacier in Europe, and it has been giving a very quick response both to short and long-term climatic variations, which resulted in a considerable reduction in surface area and volume. In fact, it experienced a loss of surface area around 50% and of thickness about 65%. That's also why it has been split into glacierets since the early 2000s. Since early 90s, the Calderone Glacier has been subjected to several multidisciplinary field campaigns to monitor and evaluate its role as an environmental indicator of the global warming. To monitor the glacier itself, Professor Pecci have always calculated the mass balance, while the rest of the monitoring concerned mainly the snowpack. A physical monitoring has been carried out with both classical geomorphologic methods in situ and remote sensing techniques. Moreover, the chemical composition of the fresh snowpack was also investigated. In fact, from 2008, the PAH, the major ions, and the paraffins were quantified, while from 2013, the elementary and organic carbon analysis was also added. In the last few years, we started to analyze also the trace elements with a high spatial resolution, and lately we also tested a new method to quantify the rare earths. The sampling is usually organized 2 times per year, in particular at the beginning and at the end of the ablation season. Unfortunately, in the last few years, the sampling campaign in September was not always successful, since, as I said, the glacier is definitely loss-making. However, the campaign consists in digging the snow pit and, after measuring the physical properties, such as densities and temperature, taking the different samples with a different spatial resolution depending on the analytes. More samples were also taken from water sources located under the glacier at different altitudes. The analyses used to investigate the chemical composition of the snowpack were ion chromatography and inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, employing, in this case, an instrument with a triple quadruple and a collision reaction cell. The analytes that were included in the analysis method are listed in the slide. With the ion chromatography, it was possible to see the main inorganic soluble ions, since the concentration of the organic ones was always too low to be detected by this instrument. On the contrary, with the new ICP-MS, it was possible to go down to concentrations around the ppt for many of these metals. During this work, I focused on the data of the past 4 years, and particularly on the results obtained with the ICP-MS. The snowpack, as you all know, is a passive sampler of aerosol from the atmosphere, and that means that looking at the stratigraphy and comparing it with the chemical composition, it is possible to reconstruct atmospheric events that led to a strong deposition. In this graph are described the snowpack profiles obtained with the aluminum fluxes for the last 4 years. All of these peaks were noticed also with many other metals, but I chose aluminium since it can be considered a marker of crustal particulate. You will notice that there are many peaks highlighted, and that's because they all match with atmospheric events that were recorded in our station located on Monte Martano, the site that I showed before on the map, and that can be also considered far from anthropogenic pollution. The usefulness of this atmospheric station on Monte Martano is that almost every perturbation and advection arriving at the Gran Sasso area at some point will also be seen there. In the Monte Martano site, there are two particulate matter sampler and an OPC. We can compare now the OPC data for the year 2020 with the relative aluminium profiles. The three peaks that you can see in the snow correspond, in fact, to the peaks given by the increased number of particles in the atmosphere at the end of March, in April, and in May. Depending on the air mass's circulation, many different advection can reach our area. The most common source, though, is always the Saharan Desert. In this graph, you can see the vertical profile of the flux of iron, a marker for Saharan advection, that was quantified in the fresh snowpack found in June 2020. As we notice with the aluminium, there are three distinguished peaks for three different advections. Using specific programs, it was possible to figure out the specific region where this dust came from and in which amount. In this case, the peak located around 250 centimeters deep was a weak Saharan advection that took place in April, while the higher peak, around 115 centimeters deep, is a stronger Saharan event that arrived in May. Looking at the circulation data, though, the third peak does not depend on a Saharan advection. However, nowadays, new dust sources are becoming more and more relevant. One of these is the Caspian region. In this particulate area, in fact, as it is noticeable from the images, a new dust source has been created in the last decade. In fact, the Aral Sea, that's very close to the Caspian one, is now drying out because of the agriculture and loss in vegetation. Using the data collected from the Monte Martano site to calculate some back trajectories with high split for the events of last year, we noticed that in late March there was an incursion of dust in Italy coming from the Caspian region. The graphs that you're looking at are relative to 2 consecutive days, and on the second one, the light blue trajectory comes from that region. Moreover, in the lower part of the second image, you may also notice that at first the altitude of the air mass was really low, so it was loaded in crustal particles, and that's why the peak in the snowpack was really intense. Since the provenance of this advection is different, we decided to investigate them from a chemical point of view in order to find a specific marker. To better address the differences between the two events, both snow from the Calderone Glacier and filters from the Monte Martano sampler were analyzed. Since we saw iron fluxes before, let's see who is the iron associated with. In this plot, it has been considered together with the silica, and both are normalized for the aluminium. In this graph, the darker dots in blue, red, and yellow, with the sampling date on it, describe the aerosol filters sampled on Monte Martano, while the lighter ones, also in pale blue, red, and yellow, represent the layers of snow in which we found the higher fluxes, and therefore that we connected to the atmospheric events. The white dots instead stands just for snow layers without any particular dust load. You may notice, looking at this plot, that there is a first separation between the values of the Caspian dust and the Saharan dust, while the snow samples seem quite homogeneous. Focusing on the dust, it catches the eye that the 2 days in which the maximum amount of PM10 was registered during Caspian advections, that are the one circled in orange on the left, have a very low silica to aluminium ratio, but for the moment it was not possible to explain why. In the snow, it is impossible to see these differences as a consequence of the debris' local contribution and on the deposition and post-deposition processes that they may have been. In this plot, the issues with the snow samples are even more clear, as the layer containing the Caspian advection is the one with a lower sulfur to aluminium ratio, while the respective dust has the higher one. Since the sampling has been done when the snowpack was already starting its ablation, it is probable that the sulfates were already shifting to the bottom layer, and this is also confirmed by the ion chromatography values, since in the first 3 meters from the top of the fresh snowpack, the sulfates always resulted lower than 0.2 ppm, that was our detection limit. Moreover, it is clear that there was a local contribution looking at the two red dots in the right side of the plot. They seem, in fact, enriched in calcium compared to the respective dust, and we know that the limestone and the clays present around the glacier have a calcium to aluminium ratio respectively equal to 390 and 190. Looking at the aerosol samples instead, there is a clear separation between the two series, probably due to the fact that in the Caspian area, as reported in literature, there is a high amount of salts and gypsum. These advections, as anticipated, were also investigated for rare earths. Turns out that in this particular case, this cannot be used as marker to assess the sources, since there aren't important differences in the patterns. This tells us that the silicate species were similar between the events, but lower in concentrations in the case of the Caspian advection. Actually, looking at the first part of the pattern from lanthanum to neodymium, we can notice that the two Saharan advections are different one from the other. They probably came from different areas, and the one was more silicatic of the other. Anyhow, we can see from this graph that changing the matrix does not affect the patterns too much, even though the concentrations in the snow are definitely lower. In order to investigate advections on snow and compare them with an active aerosol sampler, the method must definitely be modified. First of all, a sampling campaign should be added to collect the advection right after the deposition in order to minimize the local contribution and to avoid the displacement of the chemical species in the snowpack. That said, in the specific case of the Caspian advection that we saw in 2020, it would be useful to deepen our knowledge about its geochemistry of the Caspian area, in particular this silica-aluminium ratio that we didn't understand yet. So, for the moment, thank you for your kind attention.